Sorrel hadn't expected the Alpha King to grab her wrist in the middle of a harvest market. But here she was, his fingers locked around her arm like iron, his entire body rigid, his breath coming in deep, ragged pulls, like a man drowning in open air. She'd been inspecting dried foxglove at a merchant's stall. Just standing there, minding her own business, weighing a bundle of stems, and wondering whether the seller had mixed in bishop's lace to pad the weight. A perfectly ordinary morning in a perfectly ordinary crowd. The autumn sun was warm on the back of her neck, and the market square smelled of roasted chestnuts and bruised apples, and the particular earthy sweetness that came with the turning of the season. Sorrel had been looking forward to this morning all week. The mountain healers rarely came down to the valley market, and the herb selection here was 3 times what she could find in the villages near the healing house. Then, the crowd had parted. She'd felt it before she saw it. A ripple of silence spreading outward through the market square like a stone dropped into still water. Voices fell away. Bodies shifted. The merchant beside her stiffened mid-sentence and dropped to one knee, so abruptly, he knocked over a basket of dried chamomile. Someone near the bread stall followed, and then another, and Sorrel looked up to see a wall of royal guards moving through the square in formation. Behind them, flanked by his beta and 2 advisors, walked King Tavern Ashcrest. She had never seen him in person. No one from the lower quarters ever did. He was a figure from stories and rumors, a name spoken in reverence or fear, depending on who was speaking. The Alpha King, who had ended the Ashfall War by walking into the enemy's stronghold, alone. The wolf, whose howl, they said, could stop a man's heart from 100 paces. She'd expected someone monstrous. What she hadn't expected was how still he was, how controlled. He moved through the crowd like a blade through cloth, precise and unhurried, his dark eyes scanning the square with the calm efficiency of a man cataloging threats. He was tall in a way that made the guards flanking him look ordinary, broad across the shoulders in a way that suggested the strength wasn't decorative. His face was sharp and angular, all hard lines and deep-set eyes, and there was nothing soft about any of it. Sorrel looked at him the way everyone looked at him, with a mixture of awe and the instinct to become very, very small. Then she looked back at her foxglove. Kings were not her business. Herbs were her business. And this foxglove was definitely cut with bishop's lace. He was 10 paces past her when it happened. His wolf surged. She didn't see it, not exactly. But she heard the sharp intake of breath, heard the rhythm of his footsteps break, heard the low, rumbling growl that rolled through the air like distant thunder. Every person within earshot went rigid. The guards' hands flew to their weapons. A woman near the fruit stall grabbed her child and pulled him behind her skirts. Sorrel turned. The king had stopped. He stood motionless in the middle of the square, his head tilted slightly to one side, his nostrils flaring. Something behind his eyes had shifted, something predatory and desperate and utterly uncontrolled. His beta was speaking to him, low and urgent, one hand raised, as if approaching a wild animal, but the king didn't seem to hear. He turned. His gaze swept the crowd and landed on her with the force of a physical blow. Sorrel's breath left her body. He crossed the distance between them in 4 strides, and she didn't have time to move, didn't have time to think, didn't have time to do anything before his hand closed around her wrist and he pulled her toward him. He inhaled. Deep and slow, his face inches from her neck, breathing her in like she was air and he'd been suffocating. A low sound escaped his throat, something raw and involuntary that made every hair on her body stand up. The entire market had gone silent. 200 people stood frozen, watching the Alpha King press his face against the neck of a nobody herbalist in a flour-dusted apron. A guard had drawn his sword halfway before the beta waved him down. With a sharp gesture, Sorrel's heart hammered so hard she could feel it in her teeth. His grip on her wrist wasn't painful, but it was absolute. She couldn't have pulled free if she'd tried. "It's you," he said. His voice was low and rough, scraped raw with something she couldn't name. And beneath the shock, beneath the fear, beneath the impossibility of what was happening, something in her chest responded a pull, deep and disorienting and terrifyingly familiar, because she knew that voice. She knew the cadence of it, the depth, the way it roughened at the edges when something hurt. She knew it. The way she knew the sound of rain on stone, the way she knew the smell of dried lavender, the way she knew her own heartbeat. She knew that voice from the darkness, but that was impossible. The man she remembered had been a wounded stranger, a soldier brought to the healing house in the dead of night 3 months ago. She treated him without ever seeing his face. She'd stitched his wounds by touch, learned the geography of his scars with her fingertips, listened to his breathing even out as the pain receded, night after night after night. And then he'd left, and she'd never learned his name, and she'd told herself it didn't matter, she'd been lying. The king pulled back just enough to look at her. His gray eyes were wide and stunned, his composure shattered in a way that clearly terrified his guards. The beta had his hand on his sword. 2 advisors stood frozen mid-step. The entire market held its breath. Sorrel looked up at the Alpha King, at the man whose wounds she had tended in complete darkness for 3 weeks, whose hand she had held without knowing it belonged to the most dangerous wolf in existence. She pulled her wrist free, stepped back and said, "I think you have the wrong person, Your Majesty." His wolf growled low and certain and absolute, because his wolf knew exactly who she was. 3 months earlier, the storm hit the valley like a fist. Rain hammered the roof of the healing house so hard that Sorrel could feel the vibration in the soles of her feet. Wind screamed through the gaps in the shutters, and the fire in the hearth guttered and leapt with every gust. It was the kind of storm that turned the mountain road into a river and made the forest creak and groan like something alive and in pain. Sorrel was elbow-deep in a batch of wound paste when the pounding started at the door, not knocking, pounding. The flat of a hand hitting oak with enough force to rattle the hinges. Nola looked up from the surgical table she'd been cleaning, her expression shifting from irritation to alertness in less than a second. The head healer was a compact woman with silver-streaked hair and hands that hadn't trembled in 40 years. Very few things surprised her. The urgency in that pounding was one of them. "Open it," she said. Sorrel wiped her hands and crossed the room. The moment she lifted the latch, the door crashed inward, and a man fell through it. Not alone, 2 soldiers held him upright, their armor streaked with mud and rain and something darker. Behind them stood 3 more, swords drawn, eyes scanning the night like they expected the storm itself to attack. "He needs a healer," the first soldier said. His voice was clipped, military, the kind of tone that turned request into orders. Now they carried the wounded man to the table and laid him down. Sorrel caught a glimpse of dark hair, broad shoulders, the angular line of a jaw clenched so hard the tendons stood out in his neck. His shirt was soaked through, and beneath the rain and the mud, the fabric was dark with blood. Nola moved to the table and reached for the nearest lantern. "No light," the soldier said sharply. Nola froze, her hand hovering over the lamp. "I need to see the wounds." "The wounds react to light," the soldier replied. His jaw was tight, and something in his eyes looked close to panic. "Any light, flame, candle, even strong moonlight, it makes them open, it makes them spread." Nola stared at him for a long moment. Then she looked down at the man on her table. Sorrel watched her mentor's face and saw the exact moment Nola understood what she was dealing with. Cursed wounds. Inflicted by a weapon that had been soaked in old magic, the kind that turned a simple cut into something that fought against healing, something alive beneath the skin. "How long has he been like this?" Nola asked. 4 days, the soldier said. Nola's expression tightened. 4 days with cursed wounds was a death sentence for most men. That this one was still alive spoke to either extraordinary luck or extraordinary will. "Everyone out," Nola ordered. She looked at the soldiers. "All of you, wait in the front room." When the commanding soldier hesitated, she added, "If you want him alive by morning, let me work." They left, reluctantly. Sorrel could hear them arranging themselves in the corridor, boots scraping on stone, low voices exchanging terse words. Nola turned to her and spoke quietly. "I cannot do this," Sorrel blinked. In 7 years of apprenticeship, she had never once heard Nola say those words. My hands need my eyes, Nola continued. I've never been able to work without sight. You know that. Sorrel did know that. Nola was brilliant, precise, the best healer in the Northern Territories. But she worked visually, reading a wound's color and depth and edges before she ever touched it. But you can, Nola said, and her gaze was steady. You've trained for this. Every exercise I gave you in the dark, every hour you spent learning to stitch by touch alone, all of it. This is what it was for. Sorrel's stomach dropped. Nola, I've practiced on pigskin and sandbags. This is a man with cursed wounds that I've never treated before, and if we light a lantern to look at them, they'll spread, and he'll be dead by dawn, Nola replied. You're the only healer in this house who can work in total darkness. Sorrel, you've been doing it since you were a child. That was true. Sorrel had spent the first 8 years of her life in the collapsed tunnels beneath Ashenvale Keep, abandoned there as an infant and raised by the workers who mined the lower shafts. She'd learned to move, to work, to think, in absolute blackness. It was as natural to her as breathing. But natural didn't mean she was ready to cut into a stranger's cursed flesh with nothing but her fingertips to guide her. I'll be right outside the door, Nola said. I'll talk you through anything you need, but your hands have to do the work. Sorrel looked at the man on the table. His breathing was shallow and rough, each exhale carrying a faint sound of pain that he was clearly trying to suppress. Even half-conscious, he was fighting. All right, she said. Nola extinguished every light in the room. The hearth fire was smothered, the lanterns were carried out, the shutters were sealed, until not even the lightning could reach inside. The darkness was total. Sorrel stood still for a moment and let it settle around her. Her other senses sharpened the way they always did, the sound of his breathing, the smell of blood and rain, and something else, something smoky and warm beneath the copper, that made her pulse quicken for reasons she didn't understand. She moved to the table. Her fingers found the edge of his shirt and she pulled it back carefully. The wounds were wrong. She felt it the moment her fingertips made contact. The skin around the cuts was hot, far too hot, and the edges pulsed with a rhythm that had nothing to do with his heartbeat. Something lived in these wounds. Something that squirmed beneath her touch and recoiled from her fingers like it resented being found. Don't, the man said. His voice came out rough and strained, but the authority in it was unmistakable. Even bleeding on a healer's table in the pitch black, this man was used to being obeyed. Don't what? Sorrel asked, her fingers already probing the deepest wound along his left side. Don't touch me. You'll die if I don't. A pause. Then, that's my concern. Actually, it's mine, Sorrel replied. Because you're on my table, bleeding on my sheets, and if you die here, I'm the one who has to clean it up. So, hold still. Silence. She worked for hours. The wounds were layered, the curse woven into the tissue like thread through cloth. She cleaned, she stitched, she packed the deepest cuts with a poultice that Nola had developed specifically for dark magic infections. Her fingers grew slick with blood, her back ached from bending over the table. The stranger said nothing, for a long time. Then, as she tied off the last stitch along his ribs, he let out a slow breath. You're good at this, he said. It sounded like it cost him something to admit. I know, Sorrel said. Another pause. She thought she heard something that might have been a surprised exhale, almost a laugh. She stepped away from the table, wiped her hands on her apron, and moved toward the door. Behind her, his breathing had steadied, the ragged edge of pain smoothed into something more manageable. What's your name? He asked. She hesitated, her hand on the door. Sorrel, she said. What's yours? The silence that followed lasted too long. Then he said, It doesn't matter. She stepped into the corridor and closed the door behind her. Nola was waiting, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. He'll need treatment every night, Sorrel said. The curse is deep. It's going to take weeks. Nola studied her face for a long moment. Did he tell you his name? Sorrel shook her head. Nola's expression did something complicated, a tightening around the mouth, a flicker behind the eyes that looked almost like fear. Good, she said quietly. Don't. The second night was worse and better in equal measure. Worse because the curse had pushed back against her work. Stitches she'd placed with precision had loosened overnight. The wound along his ribs, the deepest one, had spread a full finger's width. Despite the poultice, whatever lived inside those cuts was fighting her, and it was strong, better because he didn't threaten her this time. She entered the darkened room and heard his breathing shift, a subtle change in rhythm that told her he'd been listening for the door, waiting for her. Back again, he said. Every night until the wounds close, Sorrel replied, setting down her supplies by touch and arranging her tools along the edge of the table where her fingers could find them. Nola's orders. And if I refuse treatment, then you die, slowly and painfully in a healer's back room, and I use your skeleton to teach anatomy lessons to apprentices. She paused. I've always wanted a skeleton. The silence that followed had a different quality than the night before, warmer. Fine, he said. She worked. The curse resisted her hands like a living thing, coiling away from the poultice, tightening around the wound edges when she tried to clean them. Twice she felt it pulse beneath his skin, a hot, rhythmic throb that made her fingers tingle unpleasantly. She gritted her teeth and kept going. You work differently than other healers, he said after a while. His voice was strained from pain, but there was genuine curiosity beneath it. Most healers use their eyes, Sorrel said. I use my hands. Why? Because I grew up in the dark. She didn't elaborate. She rarely did. The tunnels beneath Ashenvale were not something she talked about. The years of blackness, of learning to navigate the world through touch and sound and smell, while the miners who found her taught her what they could and wondered what kind of mother leaves a newborn in a mine shaft. How old were you? He asked. Sorrel's hands paused on his skin. Most people, when she mentioned growing up without light, changed the subject, looked uncomfortable, moved on. He'd asked the one question that actually mattered. I don't know, she said. They found me as an infant. I was 8 before someone brought me above ground. She felt the muscles beneath her fingers tense. Not from the wound, from something else. 8 years in the dark, he said quietly. It wasn't all bad. That was mostly a lie. But she'd had enough practice, telling it that it came out smooth. I learned. Things other healers can't do like this. She pressed the fresh poultice into the wound along his ribs, and he drew in a sharp breath. Sorry, she murmured. Don't be. It's the first time in 4 days that anything has helped. They settled into a rhythm over the nights that followed. She arrived after full dark. He waited in silence until he heard the door. She worked, and they talked. Not about anything important at first. She told him about the herbs she was studying, the failed experiment that had turned an entire batch of healing salve bright orange and made Nola's cat sneeze for 3 days straight. He listened in a way that she could feel through the darkness, an attentive stillness that made her aware of every word she chose. On the 4th night, he laughed, actually laughed. She'd been describing the time she accidentally prescribed a guardsman twice the recommended dose of valerian root, and the man had fallen asleep standing up in the middle of a changing of the guard ceremony, toppling sideways into the captain, who toppled into the next man, who toppled into the next, until an entire row of soldiers went down like dominoes. The sound of his laughter in that lightless room did something to her chest that she wasn't prepared for. It was low and rough and surprised, like he hadn't expected it, like laughing was something he'd forgotten he could do. She stopped talking. He stopped laughing, and the silence that followed was the most dangerous kind, the kind that felt full instead of empty. You're staring at me, Sorrel said. You can't possibly know that. It's pitch black. I can feel it. Another silence. She could hear his breathing, slow and deep, and beneath it the faint, rapid beat of his heart. Her fingers were still resting on the skin above his wound, and she hadn't pulled them away. And he hadn't asked her to. Go on, he said quietly. The guard, the dominoes. What happened next? She went on. On the 7th night, his hand found hers. She was packing a fresh poultice into the wound on his shoulder, the smaller one that was healing well, when his fingers brushed against her wrist, not grabbing, not stopping her work. Just a slow, deliberate contact that traced from her wrist to her knuckles and then settled, his hand resting over hers, like a question. Sorrel stopped breathing. His thumb drew a single slow circle on the back of her hand. Then another. The touch was so light, it barely qualified as pressure, and yet she felt it in every nerve of her body, from her scalp to the soles of her feet. Neither of them spoke. The darkness pressed in close and warm, and his hand stayed on hers, and her heart beat so hard, she was certain he could hear it. She should have moved. Should have gently pulled away, and continued her work, and maintained the professional distance that a healer was supposed to maintain. She was his caretaker. He was her patient. This was not allowed. Instead, she turned her hand beneath his and laced her fingers through his. His grip tightened immediately, his fingers closing around hers with a desperate strength that made her chest ache. They stayed like that for a long time. Two people, in the lightless room, holding on to each other for reasons neither of them was willing to name. On the 12th night, she realized the deep wound along his ribs had stopped responding to treatment. Her fingers traced the edges with growing dread. The curse had spread, despite everything she'd done, reaching outward beneath the skin, like roots burrowing into soil. The tissue around it was hotter than before, and when she pressed gently, he couldn't suppress the sound that escaped him. Low, guttural, the kind of pain that lives in the bones. "It's getting worse," she said. He didn't deny it. She felt his chest rise and fall beneath her hands, steady and controlled despite the agony he had to be in. "I know," he said. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you would worry. I'm your healer. Worrying is literally my purpose." "And you've done more than enough," he said. His voice was quieter than usual, resigned in a way that made her stomach twist. "The other wounds have healed. I can ride. I can return to where I need to be." "You can't ride with this wound," Sorrel said firmly, "and you certainly cannot ride when the curse inside it is spreading toward your heart." The silence that followed was different from all the others, cold and final. "How long?" he asked. "I don't know." She hated the words even as she said them. "Months, maybe less." He was quiet for a long time when he spoke again. His voice carried that same controlled calm, like a man organizing the logistics of his own execution. "Then I need to leave. Tomorrow." "No. There are things that must be done before." He didn't finish. Sorrel's hands were still on his chest. She could feel his heartbeat beneath her fingers, steady and strong, and somewhere beneath it, buried deep, the faint, wrong rhythm of the curse inching closer. "Let me try something else," she pleaded. "Let me talk to Nola." "There has to be another way." "There isn't," he said, "and you've already given me more time than I had any right to expect." His hand reached for hers one last time in the darkness. He brought her fingers to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, so gentle, it barely existed. "Thank you, Sorrel," he whispered. In the morning, he was gone. The soldiers, the blood-soaked sheets, the supplies she'd left in the sealed room, all of it cleared away like a dream dissolving in daylight. Only the faint smell of smoke and iron remained. Sorrel stood in the empty room and pressed her hand to her chest, where something that had only just begun to grow was already starting to ache with loss. She told herself it didn't matter. He was a stranger, she'd never seen his face. But her hands remembered everything. Nola found her standing there and said nothing for a long moment. Then very quietly she spoke. "The soldiers who brought him. They weren't ordinary soldiers, Sorrel." Sorrel looked at her. "They were the king's guard," Nola said. "Every one of them." The floor seemed to tilt beneath Sorrel's feet. Her mind reached for the implication and recoiled from it. "You don't mean," she started. "I told you not to ask his name," Nola said. Her voice was gentle, but her eyes were sharp and sad. "Because some truths are easier to carry when they stay in the dark." The king's guards did not give Sorrel a choice. The moment he released her wrist in the market square, 2 soldiers flanked her, and a third collected her satchel from the merchant's stall with the careful efficiency of men who had been trained to make things happen without making a scene. The crowd parted. Whispers erupted in their wake like birds startled from a hedge. Sorrel's mind was still reeling. The man in the darkness. The stranger whose wounds she'd stitched by touch for 3 weeks. The voice she'd memorized. The laugh she'd drawn out of him like pulling a splinter. The hand that had held hers in the silence. The lips that had kissed her knuckles before disappearing. The Alpha King. the most feared wolf in the northern realms. The man who had ended the Ashfall War and carried its cost in cursed flesh. Her patient, her stranger, her king. She was led through the palace gates and into a world she had never been meant to enter. The corridors were wide and high-ceilinged, smelling of beeswax and old stone and authority. Tapestries lined the walls in deep reds and golds, depicting battles and hunts and coronations. Guards stood at every junction, their postures immaculate, their eyes tracking her with quiet suspicion. Servants moved in practice patterns, each one glancing at Sorrel with the particular curiosity reserved for people who clearly did not belong. She caught a maid staring at the wound paste stains on her apron and felt her cheeks burn. A door opened into a small receiving room, with narrow windows and a fire already burning in the hearth. Sorrel was deposited inside like a parcel and left alone. She sat on the edge of a chair and pressed her hands together to stop them shaking. What was she supposed to do? Curtsy? Apologize? For what? For healing him? For not recognizing him? For the fact that she'd once told the Alpha King she wanted his skeleton for anatomy lessons. She stood, sat down again, stood again, paced the length of the room twice, counted the stones in the fireplace around, and was halfway through cataloging the medicinal properties of every herb she could think of, beginning with the letter B when the door finally opened. A man stepped inside, tall, lean, composed in a way that suggested composure was his profession. His eyes were sharp and measured, and he studied Sorrel the way a surgeon studies a wound, not unkindly, but with thorough precision. "Miss Sorrel," he said. "My name is Dashel. I serve as the king's beta." Sorrel stared at him. She'd heard that name in passing, always in the same breath as the king's, always spoken with a particular respect that bordered on wariness. Dashel, the king's right hand, the man who knew everything and revealed nothing. "Why am I here?" Sorrel asked. Dashel's expression remained perfectly neutral. "The king's wolf has not responded to anyone this way before. We believe it relates to the treatment you provided at the Mountain Healing House 3 months ago." "The treatment," Sorrel repeated. She wanted to laugh. 3 weeks in a lightless room with a stranger she'd grown to care for more than she had any right to, reduced to a single clinical word. "There is a complication," Dashel continued, "one that the king has been concealing from the court." Sorrel's stomach dropped. She already knew. She'd felt it on the last night in that sealed room. The wound along his ribs spreading like roots. The curse burrowing deeper despite everything she'd done. "The wound didn't heal," she said. Dashel's composure flickered. "Just a crack. Just for a moment." But she saw it. "No," he confirmed. "It has continued to spread. Slowly but steadily. The court healers have been unable to treat it. Their attempts in well-lit chambers have only accelerated the curse's progress." He paused. "Your treatment in darkness was the only intervention that slowed it at all." Sorrel closed her eyes. 3 months. He'd been walking around for 3 months with a curse eating him alive, and he hadn't come back. Hadn't sent for her. Hadn't asked for help. Why didn't he return to the healing house? She asked, even though she already knew the answer. Dashel looked at her steadily. "Because returning to you would have required explaining who he was. And explaining who he was would have required acknowledging that the Alpha King is dying." The word landed like a stone in still water. "How long does he have?" Sorrel asked. "The court physician estimates 3 to 4 months before the curse reaches his heart." She stood. "Take me to him." Dashel studied her for a moment. Then something shifted in his expression, a quiet satisfaction, like a man who had just confirmed a suspicion. "He may not be pleased to see you," Dashel warned. He grabbed my wrist in a crowded market and pressed his face against my neck. "I think we're past pleasantries." Dashel's mouth twitched. He led her through corridors and up staircases and past guards who straightened at the beta's approach. The palace grew quieter as they climbed, the crowds thinning, until they reached a set of heavy oak doors guarded by 2 soldiers, who looked like they had been carved from the same stone as the walls. The doors opened into a study lit by gray afternoon light. Maps covered every surface. Documents were stacked in precise columns across a wide desk, and behind the desk, his back to the window, stood Tavrin Ashcrest. She saw him clearly for the first time, the dark hair she had touched without seeing, The angular jaw she had traced with her fingertips while checking for fever. The broad shoulders she had bandaged, night after night. All of it, suddenly, shockingly visible, attached to a face that was harder and more striking than anything she had imagined. His gray eyes were the color of iron in winter, deep set beneath dark brows, and the shadows beneath them spoke of pain he was managing through sheer force of will. He was beautiful. The realization hit her with an almost physical force, and she hated the timing of it, hated that this was the thought her mind offered, while the man was literally dying in front of her. He was dying. He looked at her and went utterly still. She could see the war in his face, the wolf pushing forward, the man holding it back. His hands gripped the edge of the desk so hard the wood creaked. "Dashel," he said without looking away from her. His voice was controlled but barely. "I did not authorize this." "No, sire," Dashel agreed calmly. "Consider it initiative." "Sorrel." Tavern said her name like it cost him something. Like he'd been carrying the sound of it in his mouth for 3 months. And the weight had worn a groove. "You shouldn't be here. And you shouldn't be dying," she replied. "But here we are." His jaw tightened. She watched the muscles work beneath his skin, and remembered the feel of that jaw under her fingers, the heat of his skin, the way his breathing changed when her hands moved across unmarked flesh. "I'm resuming treatment tonight," she said. "In total darkness the way it worked before. Your wound has been getting worse because every healer since me has been working in light and the curse feeds on it." "You don't have the authority to decide that," Tavern said. "Then give me the authority, or die. Those are your options, Your Majesty." The silence that followed was so heavy it pressed against her eardrums. Dashel stood motionless by the door, watching with an expression of carefully concealed satisfaction. Tavern looked at her for a long time. She held his gaze, her heart hammering, her hands steady. "Fine," he said finally. "But this is a medical arrangement, nothing more." "Of course," Sorrel agreed. She turned to leave, and as she reached the door, she felt it. A flicker at the edge of her awareness, cold and sharp, like a finger of ice, tracing down her spine. She glanced back at Tavern. His hand had moved to his ribs, pressing against the place where the wound lived, and his face had gone pale. Something inside that wound had felt her presence. Something old and hungry and patient, and it had reached for her. The routine formed within days, familiar and foreign at the same time. Every evening after the palace settled, Sorrel was escorted to a room adjoining the king's chambers. The windows were sealed, the fire extinguished, every source of light removed until the darkness was complete. Then the connecting door opened, and she heard him enter. The sound of his footsteps in the blackness. The careful way he lowered himself onto the treatment table. The slow, controlled breathing that told her the pain was worse than he would ever admit. It was like returning to the healing house, and it was nothing like the healing house at all, because now she knew. She knew the face that belonged to the voice. She knew the crown that sat on the head she'd once cradled to check for concussion. She knew that the hands she'd held were the same hands that had signed treaties and gripped swords and shaped the fate of an entire kingdom. And the knowing changed everything. "You're quiet tonight," he said on the third evening. She was working on the wound along his ribs, her fingers tracing the curse's edges with practiced care. It had spread further than she'd feared. The roots reached almost to his sternum now, hot threads beneath the skin that pulsed with their own terrible rhythm. "I'm concentrating," she said. "You used to talk while you concentrated. You once described an entire recipe for mushroom soup while stitching a wound that should have required your full attention. That was before I knew I was narrating soup recipes to the Alpha King." A pause. Then, "Is that why you've stopped?" She didn't answer immediately. Her fingers found a new tendril of the curse, thin as thread, reaching toward his heart, and she pressed the poultice against it with steady hands while her chest tightened with fear. "You didn't tell me who you were," she said. "Would it have changed how you treated me?" "No, then it didn't matter." "It mattered to me," Sorrel said, more quietly than she'd intended. The silence that followed was full of things neither of them said. She finished her work, cleaned her hands, gathered her supplies. "Sorrel?" His voice stopped her at the door. The mushroom soup. You never told me whether you add the cream before or after the heat. She felt the smile before she could stop it. After, she said. Always after. Otherwise, it curdles. Good to know, he said. In the mornings, she did not see him. He was the king. She was a healer from a mountain outpost, who slept in borrowed quarters and wore borrowed clothes, and carried the lingering smell of wound paste on her hands. Their lives did not overlap in the light. Except they did. A new set of healer's tools appeared in her room on the fourth day. Not the battered, well-used implements she'd brought from Nola's supplies, but instruments of astonishing quality. Blades that held their edge like they'd been kissed by a smith who loved his work. A mortar and pestle carved from stone, so smooth it felt like silk. A leather roll to carry them in, embossed with a pattern of foxglove along the edge. Foxglove, the herb she'd been inspecting when he found her in the market. Sorrel carried the tools to Dashiell's office and held them up. Who sent these? Dashiell glanced at them with the practiced disinterest of a man who absolutely knew the answer. No idea, he said. They appeared in my room. How mysterious. Dashiell. Perhaps the palace has benevolent spirits with excellent taste in surgical instruments? The beta offered. Sorrel narrowed her eyes. That evening, in the sealed treatment room, she said, "Thank you for the tools." What tools? Tavern asked. The ones that appeared in my room, with the foxglove pattern. The silence had a distinct quality of guilt. I have no idea what you're referring to. Your Majesty. The leather case is embossed with your family crest on the inside flap. A longer silence. Then, that seems like an oversight, she laughed. In the darkness, she heard his breath catch at the sound. The days blurred together. She developed a routine beyond the nightly treatments. She reorganized the palace infirmary's herb stores, which were in a state of neglect that would have made Nola weep. She taught the court physician's apprentice how to prepare a proper drawing poultice, instead of the watered-down version they'd been using. She took walks in the palace gardens in the early morning when the light was thin and the paths were empty. Sometimes, they weren't empty. She would look up from a bed of lavender and see him standing at a window 3 stories above, watching her. He always looked away when she caught him. She always pretended she hadn't noticed. But the warmth that bloomed in her chest each time was getting harder to ignore. It wasn't just the warmth. Things were happening that she couldn't explain. She'd be working in the infirmary, and suddenly feel a spike of pain that wasn't hers. A sharp, burning ache along her left side, exactly where his wound lived. It would pass in seconds, but it left her breathless and shaking. Or, she'd be walking through the corridors and feel a sudden wave of exhaustion so heavy it nearly buckled her knees. Not her exhaustion, his. She could feel the difference. A bone-deep weariness that carried the particular weight of a man who had been carrying too much for too long and refused to set any of it down. One evening, she arrived for treatment, and he was already lying on the table, waiting in the unlit chamber. She worked in silence for a while, her fingers gentle on the wound. The curse pulsed beneath her touch, hot and stubborn. "Stay," he said. She paused, her hands still on his skin. "I'm not finished with the treatment." "I don't mean the treatment." His voice was quieter than she'd ever heard it. "I mean afterward. Just for a few minutes." Sorrel's heart beat hard against her ribs. She finished her work, cleaned her hands, and sat on the edge of the table beside him. She couldn't see his face, but she could feel his warmth, could hear his breathing, could smell the warm scent of him that had lived in her memory for 3 months. His hand found hers. The same way it had in the healing house, slow and deliberate, his fingers lacing through hers with a care that made her throat tighten. She squeezed back. They sat like that for a long time, 2 people in a room without light, holding on to something they weren't allowed to name. His thumb traced slow circles on her wrist, and she felt the tension in his body ease, degree by degree, until his breathing deepened and his grip loosened, and she realized with a start that he'd fallen asleep. She stayed. She stayed long past the point where her back ached and her legs went stiff, because his breathing was peaceful, and his hand was warm, and she couldn't bring herself to pull away. When she finally eased her fingers free and stood, his breathing changed instantly, a sharp, jagged inhale, the kind that comes from being ripped out of rest. "I'm here," she whispered. Go back to sleep. He didn't. She heard him sit up, heard the careful control return to his breathing. Good night, Sorrel, he said. His voice was rough, with something that wasn't sleep. Good night, Your Majesty. Tavern, he corrected quietly. When it's just us, I'm just Tavern. Her throat tightened. Good night, Tavern. She left the room, closed the door, and leaned against the corridor wall with her hand pressed to her chest where his heartbeat was still echoing inside hers. The next night it happened. She was working on the wound, her fingers pressing the poultice into the deepest part of the cursed tissue along his ribs, when the world fell away. One moment she was in the treatment room, her hands on his skin, the familiar blackness warm and close around them. The next, she was somewhere else, cold, biting, bone-deep cold, and the smell of ash and burning flesh. Gray smoke choked the air, and beneath it, the ground was churned and wet and wrong. Not mud, something darker. She was on a battlefield. Bodies lay everywhere. Soldiers in torn armor, their faces frozen in expressions she couldn't look at for more than a second. Wolves, in half-shifted form, caught between human and beast in the final moment. The silence was the worst part. No wind, no birds, no sound at all except the distant drip of something she didn't want to identify. And in the center of it all, Tavern stood. He was younger here, his face leaner, his eyes wild with something she recognized as horror. He was covered in blood, not all of it his own, and he was staring at the carnage surrounding him with an expression of absolute devastation. Tavern, she called out. He didn't hear her. He dropped to his knees beside a fallen soldier and reached for the man's face, and the sound that came out of him was not a word. It was grief, made audible, raw and broken and endless. Tavern, she screamed. The battlefield lurched. The smoke thickened. Something moved toward them with slow, deliberate intent, and Sorrel felt the curse's presence like a hand closing around her throat. She gasped and was back. The treatment room. The blackness. His skin beneath her fingers. She was trembling violently. Her hands still pressed against his wound, sweat cold on her forehead. He sat up. She felt the movement, felt the sudden tension radiating from his body. What did you see? His voice was sharp and low and terrified. Sorrel couldn't speak. Her throat was locked, her pulse hammering. Sorrel! His hands gripped her shoulders, fingers pressing hard enough to bruise. What did you see? The battlefield, she whispered. The dead. You were kneeling beside someone, and there was something in the smoke, something watching. The sound he made was not quite human. A low, agonized groan that came from somewhere deeper than his chest. How long have you been going there? She demanded, her voice shaking. How long has the curse been dragging you into that place? He didn't answer. Tavern. Every time I close my eyes, he said, and the words came out flat, stripped of everything. The voice of a man who had been enduring something monstrous in silence, for so long that he'd forgotten it was monstrous at all, every single time. The explosion came immediately. Tavern pulled away from her so fast that the table scraped against the stone floor. She heard him move across the room, heard the rigid control in his breathing, the way each exhale was carefully measured to keep whatever was inside him from breaking out. This is over, he said. Sorrel stood, her legs unsteady. What? The treatment, this arrangement, all of it. His voice was the king's voice now, cold and absolute, and designed to end conversations. You're leaving the palace in the morning, because I saw the battlefield, because the curse reached through me and touched you. The words came out through clenched teeth. Do you understand what that means? It knows you're there. It used the wound as a bridge, and it pulled you in. If I let you keep treating me, keep touching that wound, it will pull you deeper, and eventually, it won't let you leave. You don't know that. I know exactly what that place does to people, because I have been trapped inside it for a year. His voice cracked on the last word, and the sound of it, the raw, exposed edge of a man who never allowed himself to break, made her chest constrict so tightly she couldn't breathe. It takes the worst thing you've ever done, and it makes you live inside it, over and over and over. It is a prison built from your own guilt, and I will not drag you into mine. Tavern, listen to me. This is not a discussion. His voice hardened into something unyielding. I gave you access to these chambers for medical treatment. That treatment is now terminated. Terminated? She couldn't keep the disbelief out of her voice. The curse is 3 inches from your heart. If I stop treating you now, you'll be dead before winter. Then I'll be dead before winter. The words hit her like a physical blow. She stood in the blackness, her hands at her sides, her nails digging into her palms so hard they drew blood. You would rather die than let me help you, she said. I would rather die than kill you. His voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. That is not the same thing. He called the guards. She heard him give the order in that terrifyingly calm voice, like a man signing documents instead of ending everything that mattered. She was escorted from the room, from the corridor, from the wing of the palace entirely. The door closed behind her, with a sound that echoed off the stone walls like a coffin lid dropping. Sorrel stood in the servants' passage, her back against the cold wall, and felt something inside her chest begin to tear. She returned to the guest quarters and sat on the edge of the bed for a very long time, staring at her hands. The hands that had mapped his wounds without sight, the hands that had held his, the hands that could feel, even now, the phantom echo of his heartbeat in her fingertips like a rhythm that belonged to her. In the morning, a guard arrived to escort her from the palace. Her things had been packed, the borrowed clothes had been replaced with her own. The healer's tools, the beautiful instruments with the foxglove pattern, were sitting on top of her bag with a note that said simply, "Keep them." She kept them. She hated herself for how much they meant to her. Dashiell was waiting at the gate. His face was carefully blank, but something in his eyes looked like an apology. "He's making a mistake," Sorrel said. Dashiell said nothing. She walked out of the palace and didn't look back. The first day was manageable. Sorrel returned to the healing house in the mountain valley and threw herself into work. She reorganized Nola's herb stores. She treated a farmer's broken arm. She scrubbed every surface in the infirmary until her hands were raw and her mind was too tired to think. The second day was harder. She woke with a headache that wrapped around her skull like a vice, and a hollow gnawing ache in her chest that no amount of work could touch. She kept reaching for something that wasn't there, kept turning toward doorways expecting to feel his presence, kept catching his scent on her clothes and her skin even after she'd washed twice. By the 4th day, her hands were shaking. Not trembling, shaking. The kind of uncontrollable tremor that made it impossible to hold a needle, impossible to mix a poultice, impossible to do the one thing she'd built her entire life around. She stood at the workbench with a mortar and pestle she couldn't grip and wanted to scream. "Sit down," Nola said from the doorway. "I'm fine." "You are very clearly not fine. Sit down before you drop something that shatters." Sorrel sat. The ache in her chest had spread. It lived in her ribs now, a constant pressure that made every breath feel like it had to be fought for. She was cold all the time despite the summer heat. Her appetite had vanished. She couldn't sleep, and when she did sleep, she dreamed of blackness and the smell of smoke and hands reaching for hers that weren't there. Nola pulled a chair close and sat facing her. The older healer's eyes swept over Sorrel's face with clinical precision, cataloging symptoms. "How long has this been going on?" Nola asked. "Since I left the palace. 4 days. It's getting worse." Nola was quiet for a moment. Then she reached forward and pressed 2 fingers against Sorrel's wrist, checking her pulse. "Your heart rate is elevated," she said. "Your pupils are dilated. You've lost weight. Your hands can't hold steady." She released Sorrel's wrist and leaned back. "These aren't withdrawal symptoms from overwork, Sorrel. This is something else." Sorrel bit her lip. She knew what it was. She'd known since the market square, since the moment his wolf had surged, and her own had answered with a desperate, aching recognition that had nothing to do with memory and everything to do with something far older and far more terrifying. "It's a bond," Nola said, confirming what Sorrel couldn't bring herself to say, "an incomplete one. Your wolf recognized his wolf before either of you were ready for it, and the proximity during treatment, the physical contact, the intimacy of working together without sight, all of it fed the connection. It's been growing for months." "He doesn't want it," Sorrel said, her voice small. What he wants is irrelevant to the biology. The bond is forming regardless, and the longer you're separated, the more it will punish you both. Nola paused. You can feel him, can't you? His pain. Sorrel nodded. She could feel it right now. A burning ache along her left side that wasn't hers, sharper than yesterday. Sharper than the day before. The curse was still spreading. The bond can be severed, Nola said carefully. If you reject it before it completes, the connection will dissolve. You'll recover. Your hands will steady. The pain will stop. And him? Nola's silence was its own answer. If the bond severs, he loses the only thing that's been slowing the curse, Sorrel said. He'll die faster. He may die regardless. Sorrel, the curse is beyond anything I've seen. Beyond anything the court healers can manage. You are not obligated to die alongside a king who pushed you away. I'm not dying. You will be. Give it another week. Nola's voice was firm, but her eyes were gentle. The bond is feeding on your proximity to his curse. You're being drained. If you stay connected to him while that thing eats him alive, it will eat you too. Not as fast, but fast enough. Sorrel stared at her hands. The tremor had worsened while they talked. She could barely keep her fingers still. He pushed me away to protect me, she said. Yes. And protecting me is killing him faster. Yes. And staying connected to him might kill me, also. Yes. Behind them, she saw the battlefield, the smoke, the dead. Tavern on his knees with grief pouring out of him like blood from a wound that refused to close. And she saw the other things too, the ones the curse didn't touch. His hand reaching for hers in the sealed room, the sound of his laughter, rough and startled, and real. The way he'd whispered her name, like it was the only word that mattered. I can't leave him to die alone in that place, Sorrel said. Nola looked at her with an expression that held equal parts admiration and sorrow. You love him, she said. Sorrel opened her eyes. I loved him before I knew his name. I loved him before I knew his face. I loved him in the darkness when he was just a voice, and a heartbeat, and a hand holding mine. Nola pressed her lips together and said nothing for a long time. Then she stood and crossed to the medicine shelf. If you're going to do this, she said, pulling down bottles with practiced hands, then you need to be strong enough to survive it. I'll prepare what I can. But Sorrel, the curse will fight you. It will use everything it has to keep him trapped. And now that it knows you exist, it will try to trap you too. I know, Sorrel said. On the 7th day, Dashel arrived at the healing house. He looked worse than Sorrel had ever seen him. The unshakable composure was cracked, his face drawn and pale, his eyes carrying a weight that told her everything before he opened his mouth. He collapsed during a council meeting, Dashel said. The wound opened. The curse has spread past his ribs. The court physician says it will reach his heart within weeks, possibly days. Sorrel was already reaching for her bag. He won't allow anyone to treat it. Dashel continued, his voice taut. Every healer who's tried has made it worse. The light, the conventional methods, they only feed the curse. He needs darkness. He needs you. Then take me to him. Dashel hesitated. The hesitation told her everything. He gave orders, Dashel said. Specific orders. You are not to be admitted to the palace. Sorrel slung her bag over her shoulder and met his eyes with a steadiness she didn't feel. Then, he can give me those orders himself, she said. If he's still conscious when I get there. Dashel stared at her for a beat. Then something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, something fiercer. The carriage is outside, he said. The palace corridors were nearly empty when Sorrel stormed through them. Word had spread. She could see it in the faces of the servants, who pressed themselves against the walls as she passed, in the guards who exchanged glances but did not stop her, in the eerie hush that had settled over the entire building like a held breath. Dashel walked beside her, matching her pace, and whatever silent authority he carried cleared their path better than any announcement could have. They reached the king's chambers. 2 guards stood at the doors, their expressions hard. No one enters, the taller one said. King's orders? Dashel opened his mouth, but Sorrel was faster. Your king is dying behind that door, she said. And I am the only person in this palace who can treat him. You can let me through, or you can explain to the realm tomorrow why you followed orders from a dead man. The guards looked at Dashel. Dashel looked at them with the particular expression of a man who was not going to help them out of this situation. The taller guards stepped aside. Sorrel pushed through the doors. The chamber was dark. Not the careful, sealed darkness of the treatment room, but the desperate darkness of a man who had torn the curtains closed and smothered every flame because the light made the agony worse. She could smell blood in the air, fresh and sharp, mixed with the warm scent she would have known anywhere on earth. "Get out," his voice came from the far side of the room. Rough, wrecked. Barely recognizable as the controlled, measured tone she'd come to know. "No," Sorrel said. She moved through the blackness by instinct, her feet finding their way around furniture she couldn't see, her hands outstretched until her fingers found the edge of the bed. He was there. She could feel the heat radiating from him before she touched him. Wrong heat, fever heat, the kind that came from a body fighting something. It couldn't beat. Her fingers found his chest, and she flinched. The wound had spread far past his ribs. She could feel the cursed tissue reaching across his torso, hot and pulsing, the roots threading toward his heart with a patience that was almost cruel. "You shouldn't have come," he said. His voice broke on the last word. "You keep saying that," Sorrel replied, her hands already working, already reaching for the supplies in her bag. "And I keep not listening. You would think a king would recognize a pattern." She cleaned the wound. She packed it with the strongest drawing poultice Nola had ever formulated. A recipe the old healer had spent 3 days perfecting while Sorrel lay in her own bed shaking from bond sickness. She worked by touch the way she always had, her fingers steady despite the tremor that had plagued them for a week. Because this mattered more than shaking, more than fear, more than anything, he let her work. He didn't have the strength to stop her, and they both knew it. When she finished, she sat on the edge of the bed beside him. His breathing was shallow and rough, each inhale a small battle. She could feel the curse pulsing beneath his skin, feel its hunger, its patience, its absolute certainty that it would win. "You need to leave," Tavern whispered, "before the curse finds you again." "The curse already found me," Sorrel said. "I've been feeling your pain for a week, every spike, every burn, every moment the wound spreads. I feel it in my own ribs like it belongs to me." She heard his breathing stop. "That's not possible," he said. "It's the bond, Tavern. Your wolf recognized mine in the market square." "My wolf answered. The connection has been growing since the first night I treated you at the healing house, and it doesn't care that you're a king and I'm a nobody from a collapsed mine shaft. It doesn't care that you think pushing me away will save me. All it knows is that we belong to each other, and the longer we fight it, the faster it kills us both." The silence that followed was the longest of her life. "Both," he repeated. His voice was hollow. "If the curse kills you, the bond will drag me down with you." Nola confirmed it. "I have weeks, maybe less, before the drain becomes irreversible." She paused. "So you can stop pretending that sending me away is noble. It isn't saving me, it's just making sure we die separately instead of together." A sound came from him, then, that she had never heard before and hoped she would never hear again. A broken, gutted sound that was half grief and half fury, directed entirely at himself. "I was trying to protect you," he said. "That was the only thing I had left. The one thing I could still do right. And I couldn't even do that. You cannot protect me from something that lives inside both of us. Then what am I supposed to do?" The rawness in his voice was devastating. "Watch you die because my curse decided to share itself with the one person who—" He stopped. "The one person who—" "What?" Sorrel asked softly. She could hear his heart beating, fast and unsteady, and beneath it, the wrong rhythm of the curse. But beneath that, something else. Something warm and desperate and real. "The one person who made the darkness feel safe," he finished. And the confession came out like something he'd been holding behind his teeth for months, something he'd swallowed and buried and refused to look at because looking at it meant admitting that the Alpha King had fallen in love with a voice and a pair of hands in a lightless room and hadn't recovered since. "I hear you everywhere," he continued. the words spilling now like a dam breaking. In the corridors, in council meetings, in my sleep. I hear your voice telling me about mushroom soup and sleeping guardsmen and the proper way to pack a wound. I reach for you, and you're not there, and it feels like the ground has been pulled out from under me every single time. Sorrel's eyes burned with tears. She couldn't see. You should have told me, she whispered. What would I have said? I'm the Alpha King, and I fell apart for an herbalist I met in a lightless room. That the most terrifying thing in my life isn't the curse, or the dying, or the battlefield. Every time I close my eyes, it's the thought that something I carry inside me could hurt you. She found his face in the blackness. Her fingers traced the line of his jaw, his cheekbone, the hollow beneath his eye where exhaustion had carved itself deep. He turned his head into her palm, and she felt the shudder that ran through his entire body. Then, let me stay, she said. Not because I have to, because I want to, because I loved you before I knew your name. Tavrin. I loved you when you were just a wounded stranger who laughed like he'd forgotten how. I loved you when you kissed my hand and left without saying goodbye. And I love you now. Cursed and stubborn and terrified and all. He kissed her. It wasn't gentle. His mouth found hers with the desperate accuracy of a man who had memorized her location by sound and scent, and the pull of something deeper than either. His hands came up to cradle her face, and the kiss was deep and aching and tasted like grief and hope and the salt of tears she didn't know which of them had shed. She kissed him back with everything she had. Every night spent, without sight, every empty morning after he left, every day of aching and shaking and wanting. She poured it all into the press of her mouth against his, and he answered with a sound that vibrated through his chest and into hers. His arms wrapped around her and pulled her against him, and the contact was overwhelming. Every point where their bodies touched hummed with something electric, the bond surging between them like a current finally given a circuit to complete. If you stay, he murmured against her lips, I won't be able to let you go again. Good, she breathed. Don't. He deepened the kiss, his hands sliding into her hair, and she felt the bond flare between them like a flame catching dry wood, hot and bright and irrevocable. What followed was the bond, claiming what it had always known. The careful distance they'd maintained for months collapsed, and the connection between them deepened beyond anything either of them had imagined. He marked her at the juncture of her neck and shoulder, the bite instinctive and absolute, and the bond snapped into place like a lock clicking home. She marked him back without thinking, and the bond sealed with a force that stole the breath from both of them. It settled in her chest like a second heartbeat, warm and golden and absolute. His, hers, theirs. Afterward, he pulled her against his chest and held her so tightly she could feel his heartbeat against her spine. He fell asleep within minutes. True sleep. Deep and peaceful and dreamless. Sorrel lay in his arms and felt the bond humming between them, bright and whole and unbreakable. She felt his pain too. The wound still burning, the curse still reaching, but it felt distant now, muted by the warmth of their connection. She closed her eyes. She smiled, and then the darkness changed. The warmth drained from the air, the bed disappeared from beneath her. The smell of smoke and ash replaced the sweetness of his skin, and when Sorrel opened her eyes, she was standing on the battlefield, and she was not alone. The dead were everywhere. They stretched across the churned ground in every direction. Soldiers and wolves and civilians tangled together in the terrible democracy of a battlefield that made no distinction between combatants and innocents. The sky above was the color of iron, low and heavy, and pressing down like a lid on a coffin. The smell hit her first. Ash and copper, and the wet, heavy scent of earth that had been soaked in things earth was never meant to absorb. It filled her lungs and coated the back of her throat, and she choked on it before she could stop herself. Tavrin, she called. He was there. Standing in the center of the carnage, barefoot and bare-chested, the cursed wound on his ribs glowing with a faint, sick light that was the only illumination in this dead place. His eyes were fixed ahead, his face emptied of everything except endurance. This was what he saw every time he closed his eyes. This was the prison the curse had built from his own memory, his own guilt. his own unhealed grief. And he had been standing in the middle of it alone for over a year. Sorrel moved toward him. The ground shifted beneath her feet, soft and yielding in a way that made her stomach turn. She didn't look down. "Tavrin, can you hear me?" He turned his head slightly. Recognition flickered in his gray eyes, followed immediately by horror. "No," he said. "Not you. You can't be here. You have to leave." "I'm here because of the bond," Sorrel said, reaching for his hand. "It pulled me in when you fell asleep. We're connected now. Completely. Where you go, I go. Then I'll wake up. I'll break the connection. I'll." He trailed off because the dead were moving. They rose in a slow, terrible wave, pulling themselves upright with movements that were wrong in every way that mattered. Not alive, not dead. Something in between, something animated by the curse's hunger and shaped by Tavrin's guilt into the faces of every person he had failed to save. They surrounded the clearing in a ring of accusation. Hundreds of faces, each one distinct, each one carrying a wound that would never close. "You did this," they said, not in unison, worse. In a staggered, overlapping chorus that made the words echo and build and compound until the accusation was deafening. "You did this. You did this. You did this." Tavrin's hand clenched around hers so hard it hurt. She could feel him through the bond, feel the tsunami of guilt that crashed through him, feel the way it dragged him under, like a current he'd stopped fighting long ago. "Don't listen," Sorrel said, gripping his hand. "This isn't them. This is the curse using your guilt as a weapon. It's not wrong," Tavrin said, his voice barely audible. "I gave the order. I marched on their settlement. The dead parted. A child stepped forward. She was small and dark-haired, no more than 7 or 8, wearing a dress that was too large for her and carrying a wooden doll in one hand. Her eyes were enormous and brown and filled with a sorrow so profound it didn't belong on a face that young Sorrel felt Tavrin's entire body seize. "No," he whispered. "Not her. Please." The child looked up at him. "You promised," she said. Her voice was small and clear, and cut through the chorus of the dead like a blade through cloth. "The soldiers said the king promised no one would be hurt. You promised." Tavrin made a sound that was not a word. His knees buckled and Sorrel caught him, bracing his weight against her. Through the bond she saw it. The memory that the curse fed on most. The village at the edge of the Steelgrave territory. Tavrin had ordered it evacuated before the battle, had sent soldiers ahead with assurances that the civilians would be moved to safety, but the evacuation had come too late for one family. The battle reached the village before the soldiers could clear the last houses, and a child named Petra had been in the house that burned. He had carried her out himself. She died in his arms. "You promised," the ghost child said again, and Tavrin sank to his knees. And Sorrel felt his grief, through the bond like a knife being driven between her ribs. The curse tightened. She could feel it, feel the way it fed, on his surrender, the way it grew stronger every time he accepted the guilt as truth. The wound on his ribs flared brighter, and she gasped as a mirror of it blazed along her own side. They were running out of time. "Tavrin, look at me." She dropped to her knees in front of him, taking his face in her hands the way she had 100 times without seeing him. Fingers on his jaw, thumbs on his cheekbones, holding him steady. "She died because of me," he said. "She died because of war," Sorrel replied, her voice shaking but fierce. "War that you tried to prevent. War that you fought to end. You sent the evacuation order. You carried her out of the fire yourself. You did everything a man could do, and it wasn't enough. And that is a tragedy, Tavrin. A real, devastating, unforgivable tragedy. But it is not your debt to pay with your life." "You don't know that," he said, and his voice was so broken she almost couldn't bear it. "I do know that," Sorrel said, "because I spent 8 years in the darkness, believing the same thing about myself." He went still. "I was left in a mine shaft as a newborn," she continued, her voice thick with tears. "Abandoned, thrown away like something that didn't matter. And I spent my whole life believing I deserved it. That if I'd been better, somehow, worth more, somehow, my mother would have kept me. I carried that guilt like a stone in my chest. And I let it tell me that I didn't deserve to take up space, didn't deserve to want things, didn't deserve to be loved. The dead were pressing closer. The child's ghost was watching with those enormous sad eyes. The curse pulsed and tightened and tried to drown her words. Sorrel held on. But it was a lie. Tavrin, the guilt was a lie. My mother's choice was hers, not mine. Just like Petra's death was war's doing, not yours. You didn't start the fire. You didn't fail the evacuation. You gave every order, right? And the world gave you the wrong outcome. And you have been punishing yourself for it ever since. Her thumbs traced his cheekbones, wiping away tears she couldn't see, but could feel through the bond. Petra deserved to live, Sorrel said softly. So do you. And holding on to this guilt doesn't honor her memory. It doesn't bring her back. It just keeps you trapped here, dying, while the world out there loses the king who would have burned himself alive to save one child. She turned to the ghost, the small girl with the wooden doll and the enormous eyes. He tried, Sorrel said to her. He tried to save you, and he has never forgiven himself for failing. But you know that, don't you? You know, he carried you out of the fire. You know he held you. The child looked at Sorrel. Then she looked at Tavrin, and something in her expression shifted. The sorrow remained, but beneath it, something softer surfaced. Understanding. Maybe even peace? You carried me, the child said. Tavrin's breath hitched. I did. I was scared, and then I wasn't, because you were there. The sob that tore from Tavrin's chest shattered something that had been locked inside him for over a year. Sorrel held him as he broke, as the grief and the guilt and the impossible weight of every life lost in a war he'd never wanted poured out of him in great, wrenching waves. Let her go, Sorrel whispered, her arms tight around him. Let them all go. Not because you're forgetting, not because it didn't matter, but because you've carried this long enough, and you're allowed to put it down. The child smiled, small and sad and real. She set the wooden doll on the ground at Tavrin's feet. Then she turned and walked into the fog, and she didn't look back. One by one, they dissolved like smoke, like breath on a winter morning, like grief finally given permission to pass through instead of staying forever. The chorus faded, the battlefield dimmed, the iron sky softened. The wound on Tavrin's ribs flared once, bright and hot and furious, and then the light died. The curse tightened, fought, clawed at its host like a living thing being torn from the body it had claimed, and then it broke. Sorrel felt it snap like a cord pulled too taut. The curse shattered, and the fragments scattered into the fog and were gone. The battlefield dissolved. The dead were at peace. Tavrin collapsed in her arms, shaking, emptied out, and she held him on the soft, wrong ground as the fog thinned and the darkness warmed, and the world rebuilt itself around them. I've got you, she whispered, pressing her face against his hair. I've got you! It's over! She woke in his bed, in his arms, in the warm golden light of dawn, pouring through curtains that had somehow come open during the night. On his skin, on the wound, Sorrel sat up in a panic, reaching for his ribs, expecting to find the curse flaring and spreading. What she found instead made her breath catch. The wound was closed. Not healed entirely. The scar was there, raised and silver and permanent, a reminder that would never fully fade. But the heat was gone. The pulsing was gone. The terrible, wrong rhythm that had lived beneath his skin for over a year was silent. Tavrin was watching her. His gray eyes were clear for the first time since she'd known him, the shadows beneath them lighter, the hollows in his cheeks already beginning to soften. He looked like a man who had slept, truly slept, for the first time in over a year. He reached up and touched her face. His thumb traced the line of tears. She didn't realize she was crying. Thank you, he whispered, for finding me in the dark. The scar never disappeared completely. Some mornings, Tavrin would press his hand against his ribs and go quiet for a moment, and Sorrel would feel the echo of old pain through the bond, a faint pulse that had no malice left in it, just memory. She would reach for his hand and he would lace his fingers through hers, and the pulse would fade like a note held too long, dissolving into the silence that followed. Healing was slow, honest and imperfect, and stubbornly gradual. in the way that real healing always is. There were nights when he woke gasping, reaching for ghosts that were no longer there, and Sorrel would hold him and talk about nothing, about herb gardens and terrible soup, and the apprentice who once turned a cat orange, until his breathing settled and his grip on her loosened, and he remembered where he was. There were harder nights too. Nights when the grief surfaced fresh and raw, when the names of the dead sat heavy on his tongue, and he needed to speak them aloud to someone who would listen without flinching. Sorrel listened. She learned every name. She carried them alongside him. Not because the weight was hers, but because love meant you didn't let someone carry impossible things alone. The court adjusted. Eventually, a foundling herbalist from a collapsed mine shaft was not the queen anyone had anticipated. The whispers followed Sorrel through every corridor, every banquet, every formal event where she stood beside Tavern in borrowed finery and tried not to trip on her own hem. "They'll come around," Tavern told her one evening, pulling her close in the privacy of their chambers. "And if they don't, then they can take it up with their king, who happens to be profoundly and irreversibly in love with his mate and has absolutely no intention of apologizing for it." Sorrel smiled against his chest. Nola visited once in the autumn, inspecting the scar with professional thoroughness and Sorrel's work with professional pride. She ran her fingers along the healed tissue the way she'd taught Sorrel years ago, checking for heat, for tension, for any trace of the curse that had nearly claimed him. She found nothing. "You did well, child," she said. And from Nola, who had never once offered praise, she didn't mean. That was the highest compliment in existence. Before she left, Nola pressed a small leather pouch into Sorrel's hands. Inside were seeds, foxglove, lavender, chamomile, and a dozen other herbs from the Healing House garden. "For your own stores," Nola said. "Every queen should have a garden." Sorrel planted them beneath the window of the palace infirmary she'd rebuilt from the ground up. They bloomed that spring in defiant, glorious profusion. Dashiell never said "I told you so," but his expression, whenever he saw them together, carried a quiet, unmistakable satisfaction that said it loudly enough. Once, passing him in the corridor, Sorrel caught him humming. When she raised an eyebrow, he looked at her with absolute composure and said, "I have no idea what you're referring to." Months passed. The scar faded from silver to pale white. The nightmares grew less frequent, then rare, then gone. On a morning in late spring, Sorrel woke to pale golden light and the sound of birdsong through an open window. Tavern was still asleep beside her, his breathing deep and even, his face peaceful in a way that still made her chest ache with gratitude. One arm was draped over her waist, holding her close, even in sleep. No curse. No battlefield waiting behind his eyelids. She watched him for a moment. Then she settled back against his chest, felt his arm tighten around her, felt the bond humming between them, warm and steady and whole. He stirred slightly, and his lips brushed her hair. "Sorrel," he murmured, half asleep. "I'm here," she whispered. His hand found hers in the light, and they slept.